I remember the exact weight of the social worker's briefcase. It was brown leather, cracked at the corners, and she set it on the table between us like a wall, like something she could hide behind while she explained to me, in the careful voice adults use when they have already decided something and simply need you to stop arguing, that the Dawes County foster system had officially exhausted its options for Mara and me. My name is Eliot Voss. I was 17 years old. My sister Mara was 14, and on the morning of April 3, 1947, a woman named Mrs. Pruitt sat across from us in a cinder-block room at the Pembroke County Office of Child Welfare in rural eastern Kansas, and told us, without ever using the word sorry, that our placement had ended. The Hargrove family had requested our removal. We had been with them 9 months, the longest placement we had held since our parents died in a grain elevator accident outside of Salina in 1943. Before the Hargroves there had been the Mullenses, who needed a boy to work their sorghum fields and hadn't counted on getting a boy who also came with a girl. Before the Mullenses there had been the Eversons, who were kind enough but moved to Colorado without making room in the car for us. And before all of them, there had been 4 years of Pembroke Children's Home, where Mara and I had learned to be quiet, to be small, and to protect each other with a ferocity that apparently made us difficult to place. "You're nearly 18, Mrs. Pruitt said to me. She was looking at her papers, not at my face. The state's obligation to provide placement ends at majority. We can keep Mara in the system for another 4 years, until she turns 18. But that would require you to relinquish." "No," I said. She looked up then. Behind me, Mara's hand found the back of my chair. She didn't touch me. She just rested her fingers there, like an anchor. "Eliot." Mrs. Pruitt pressed her lips together. "You have to be reasonable. You are a 17-year-old boy, with no income, no residence, and no." I said no. I kept my voice even. I had learned at Pembroke Children's Home that raised voices got you sent to your room, and quiet voices got you heard. "We are not being separated. Whatever you have for us, we take together, or we walk out that door together. Your choice." Mrs. Pruitt looked at me for a long moment. Then she opened her briefcase and took out a second folder, thinner than the first. "There is one option," she said. "It came through the county assessor's office this morning. I hadn't planned to present it because I don't think it's suitable." She slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a deed transfer document. At the top, in the formal language of county bureaucracy, it explained that one Gertrude Voss, I recognized my grandmother's name, had died intestate in February, her small estate absorbed by the county for back taxes. The county, after 2 failed auction attempts, was disposing of the remaining asset, a property in the town of Harwick, Kansas. Population 312. The property consisted of 1/2-acre lot on the western edge of town, including 1 decommissioned grain silo, 22 feet in diameter and 48 feet tall, last used in 1931, sealed by county order in 1934 following a structural inspection that had described it as not fit for agricultural use. Transfer price to surviving heirs, $3. Mara leaned over my shoulder and read the paper. Then she said, very quietly, "We have $3. We did. Between us and the combined treasury of our entire lives, we had $3.40. That silo," Mrs. Pruitt said, "has been empty for 13 years. The town of Harwick is half abandoned. There's no economy there, no jobs, no prospects. You would be taking 2 children with no resources into a derelict structure in a dying town and calling it a home." I looked at her. I thought about 4 years at Pembroke Children's Home. I thought about the Mullenses and the Eversons and the Hargroves. I thought about every place that had taken us in and then decided we were too much trouble, that we were too attached to each other, that 2 was a problem that could be solved by becoming 1. "Where do I sign?" I asked. The bus from Pembroke to Harwick took 4 hours and cost 60 cents each, which left us $1.20. Mara sat by the window the entire ride and did not speak, but she was not being sullen. Mara was never sullen. She was thinking. I could see it in the way her fingers moved against her knee, counting something, working through something, her mind doing the quiet, furious arithmetic that had always made her better at problems than anyone twice her age. She was 14 and she read everything she could find and she remembered all of it. At Pembroke, the other children had called her the library, partly because she was always reading and partly because if you asked her anything she would answer, precisely and completely, whether you wanted that much information or not. I was the one who talked to people. Mara was the one who understood things. Between us, we had managed. "Tell me about grain silos," I said. She had been reading a pamphlet she found on the bus seat. She set it down without being annoyed at the interruption. A standard wooden stave silo from the 1920s would be about 20 feet in diameter and 40 to 50 feet tall, she said. If it was sealed in good condition, the interior might still be structurally sound. The walls would be thick for insulation. Temperature inside would be fairly stable year-round. Cooler in summer, warmer in winter than the outside air. Could you live in one? She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything. You would need to solve ventilation, and light, and water, obviously. She paused. But the structure itself, if it held, would actually be quite good, better than most of what we've had. The bus let us off at a gas station on the edge of Harwick, Kansas, at 3 in the afternoon. The town was exactly what Mrs. Pruitt had suggested. 2 streets, a diner, a post office, a hardware store with most of its windows boarded, a church, and a scattering of houses with the worn, patient look of structures that had survived the Depression by simply refusing to fall down. The silo was visible from the bus stop. It rose above the flat Kansas landscape like a lighthouse, its corrugated steel sides weathered to a deep rust orange that caught the late afternoon sun. From this distance it looked enormous and permanent and completely indifferent to us. We walked toward it carrying everything we owned, which fit in 2 canvas bags. The lot around the silo was overgrown with buffalo grass and thistle. A rusted padlock secured a steel door set into the base, about 4 feet tall, so you had to duck to enter. A county seal had been nailed across it, yellow with age, stamped, "Condemned, no entry." I looked at the seal. I looked at the deed in my hand. Then I looked at Mara. "We own it," she said. "We own it," I agreed. I broke the padlock with a rock. What we found inside the silo stopped us both in the doorway. I had expected darkness and emptiness and the smell of rot. There was some of all of those things, but there was also something I had not expected. The interior of the silo was vast. Standing inside it and looking up was like standing at the bottom of a well that opened to the sky, because at the very top of the silo, 48 feet above us, a circular ventilation hatch had been left open, and through it, a perfect column of afternoon light fell straight down through the center of the dark space and illuminated the earthen floor in a circle of gold. Mara walked into that circle of light and stood in it and looked up through the hatch at the coin of blue Kansas sky. "It's like a cathedral," she said. She was right. The curved walls rose around us, the steel ribs catching the light in horizontal bands, the whole space humming faintly with the wind that moved across the open hatch 48 feet above. It smelled of old grain and dry metal and the particular mineral emptiness of a place that had been waiting a long time for someone to return to it. There was a ladder bolted to the interior wall, rising all the way to the hatch. At the base of the ladder, someone, my grandmother I would later understand, had stacked a series of wooden crates covered with canvas tarps dark with dust. Along the curved base of the far wall, I found a workbench, hand-built from rough lumber, still solid, with tools hanging above it on hooks, a hammer, several chisels, a hand drill, a brace and bit set. My grandmother had been a practical woman. She had owned this silo from 1921 until her death, and whatever the county thought about its fitness for agricultural use, she had clearly used it for something. Mara was already pulling canvas off the crates. "Eliot," she said, I went to her. The crates were filled with mason jars, hundreds of them, sealed with wax and metal lids, each one labeled in my grandmother's precise handwriting. Beans, tomatoes, corn, pickled beets, apple preserves, dried apple rings, dill cucumbers, sorghum molasses, dried herbs in paper packets, rosemary, thyme, sage, seeds, dozens of envelopes of seeds, each one dated 1934, labeled with the variety, and beneath the seed envelopes, at the very bottom of the last crate, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with kitchen twine, a notebook. I picked it up carefully. The cover was stiff but intact. Inside, my grandmother's handwriting, smaller and tighter than the jar labels, filled page after page. The first line read, "For whoever comes after, I hope it is family. I hope they are hungry enough to be patient. I should tell you about those first weeks, honestly, because I owe you that. We nearly starved. Not because of the food in the crates. That was more than enough to keep us going through the spring and into summer. We nearly starved in a different way. The kind of starving that isn't about food. The kind that happens when you are 17 and 14 and completely alone in a dying town where no one has any particular reason to care whether you survive. Harwick had 312 people and approximately zero enthusiasm for two orphaned strangers who had taken up residence in the old Voss silo on the edge of town. We were curiosities at first, then objects of mild suspicion, then simply part of the landscape, like the boarded-up hardware store and the cracked grain elevator on the east side of town. The diner was run by a woman named Dolores Fitch, 50 years old, wide as she was tall, with hands that could crack walnuts without assistance and a manner that communicated absolute efficiency and no nonsense whatsoever. She was the first person in Harwick to speak to us with something approaching respect. I walked in 3 days after we arrived and asked if she needed help washing dishes. She looked me over from boots to hairline without expression. "You eat?" she asked. "When I can get it. You work for meals, 2 meals a day, morning and noon. Dishes, hauling, whatever I need. The girl too, if she can be useful." "She's more useful than me," I said. Dolores Fitch made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Sit down, I'll feed you first and then we'll see." It was the kindest thing anyone had done for us since our parents died. Mara spent her mornings at the diner washing dishes and her afternoons reading my grandmother's notebook from first page to last and then beginning again. She was looking for something, I could tell, doing that arithmetic in her head, fingers moving against her knee. I spent my mornings at the diner and my afternoons making the silo livable. I built a sleeping loft from lumber salvaged from an abandoned house at the edge of town, with permission from no one because there was no one to ask. I patched gaps in the silo wall with a tar compound I found in my grandmother's workbench. I rigged a curtain from canvas over the low door to keep out the wind. I installed a small wood-burning stove, salvaged from the same abandoned house, running the pipe up through a hole I cut with my grandmother's drill. The silo's interior temperature, as Mara had predicted, was remarkable. In April, when the Kansas nights were still bitter, the inside of the silo stayed 15 degrees warmer than the outside air. The thick steel walls absorbed the day's heat and held it through the night. In the summer, the same thermal mass would keep the interior cool while the plains baked. On the 16th day, Mara looked up from my grandmother's notebook and said, "I know what she was doing." My grandmother's name was Gertrude Voss, and she had been a farmer's wife for 30 years and a widow for 11 before the county took her land for back taxes and left her with half an acre and a decommissioned silo. What she had done with those 11 years of widowhood, as documented in 214 pages of careful handwriting, was conduct an experiment. The silo had been condemned for grain storage because its concrete floor had cracked, compromising the moisture barrier necessary to keep stored grain dry. But Gertrude Voss had not been interested in storing grain. She had been interested in growing things. She had begun, according to the notebook, in 1935, the worst year of the Dust Bowl, when the topsoil of eastern Kansas was literally blowing away in clouds so thick they turned noon into midnight. While her neighbors watched their fields die and their animals suffocate, Gertrude had carried soil into her silo in buckets, not the thin, depleted topsoil from her former fields, but rich, dark soil from the creek bottom a mile east of town, the lowest point of a small watershed where organic matter had accumulated over decades. She had hauled it in a wheelbarrow, one load at a time, and spread it on the floor of the silo to a depth of 8 inches. Then she had planted. The notebook documented 12 growing seasons inside the silo. What she had planted, what had grown, what had failed, what had surprised her. She had discovered through patient trial and error that the silo's circular interior created its own microclimate. The ventilation hatch at the top produced a natural convection current, drawing warm air up and out during the day and allowing cool air to settle at night, moderating temperature swings. The curved walls deflected wind. The single south-facing gap she had cut in the wall, a 6-inch slot covered with salvaged window glass, sealed with putty, admitted morning light that tracked across the floor in a slow arc, reaching every quadrant of the planting circle by mid-afternoon. In the silo's first growing season, 1935, while the Dust Bowl destroyed crops across 5 states, my grandmother had harvested tomatoes, pole beans, squash, carrots, onions, and enough dried herbs to fill 20 jars. The notebook's middle sections were dense with observations about soil, what she added to it, how she maintained it, what she had learned. She hauled manure from the remaining livestock in town. She composted every scrap of organic material she could find. She planted cover crops in winter and turned them under in spring. She maintained earthworm populations with the devotion of a shepherd tending a flock. By 1940, according to the notebook, the soil inside the silo was producing yields that she had never seen in 30 years of farming the surrounding fields. The secret is not the structure, she had written in 1941. The structure only creates the conditions. The secret is the soil. Care for the soil, and the soil will care for everything that grows from it. This is not a complicated idea. It is the oldest idea there is. We have simply forgotten it. The final entry was dated January 1947, 6 weeks before she died. I have sealed the silo and preserved what I can. I do not know who will come for it. I do not know if I have any family left who would want this. But I could not let it simply end. Everything I have learned is in these pages. The soil is healthy and waiting. The seeds are viable if stored properly. Someone is going to need this. I believe that, even if I cannot know who, feed people. That is the entire instruction. Everything else is detail. Mara closed the notebook. She looked at me. We have 214 pages of instructions, she said. We have 12 years of improved soil. We have seeds dated 1934 that are probably still viable if stored in the cool and dry. She paused, and we are in a town where half the people are still recovering from the Dust Bowl and the war, and people are quietly hungry in the way that people in small towns are hungry when they are too proud to say so. I looked at the floor of the silo, at the cracked concrete that had condemned it for grain storage, at the dark soil visible in the cracks, rich and dark as chocolate cake, alive with the earthworms my grandmother had tended for 12 years. We grow food, I said. We grow food, Mara agreed. More than we need, much more. We can't run a farm from inside a silo. We're not running a farm. She held up the notebook. We're building something different, she called it. In here, a constant garden, something that produces all year, not seasonally. Something that doesn't stop when the weather turns or the rain fails. She looked up at the ventilation hatch, at that circle of sky. The silo isn't a limitation, it's the whole point. It's the thing that makes year-round production possible in Kansas. I thought about it for a long moment. We need more soil, I said. Yes, and we need the glass for that light slot she describes. Yes, and we need to fix the convection system. She mentions it needs a baffle added to the hatch to control airflow in high winds. How do we get money for any of that? Mara thought for a moment. Then she said, "What did grandmother have that people in this town needed?" I looked at the crates, at 200 mason jars of preserved food, at seed envelopes dated 1934 that had sat in cool, dry storage for 13 years. Food, I said. Food, she agreed. And now it's our turn. We opened the first seeds on a Tuesday in late April, 13 years after my grandmother had sealed them in their envelopes. I will not pretend I was not afraid. Everything we had was in those envelopes and in that notebook, and if the seeds were dead, if 13 years had taken whatever life was left in them, then we had nothing. Mara tested them the way the notebook instructed. 20 seeds on a damp cloth, covered, left in a warm corner for 5 days. She checked them on the 6th morning, kneeling on the silo floor, her face very still. Then she looked up at me. 17 out of 20, she said. 85% germination. I sat down on the floor right where I was and put my head in my hands, not from grief but from relief so total it took the strength out of my legs. We planted on the 1st of May. The notebook gave us the arrangement. Plants mapped in concentric rings from the center of the floor outward, tall plants toward the edges where the curved wall would support them. Low plants in the center circle where the light was most direct. Climbing plants trained up the interior wall on twine strung between the bolted ribs of the steel. She had designed the whole system over 12 years of observation, adjusting and refining, until the planting arrangement made the most of every hour of light that entered through the hatch and the glass slot. We followed her instructions exactly. We had no reason to do otherwise and every reason to trust her. By June, the interior of the silo had transformed. The climbing beans had taken to the wall ribs with an enthusiasm that felt almost grateful. The tomato plants, which my grandmother had described as the great beneficiaries of the silo's warmth and shelter from Kansas wind, were already 2 feet tall and setting fruit. The herb circle nearest the door perfumed the whole space with rosemary and basil, and the smell of it when I ducked through the low door each morning was so alive and green and vital that it stopped me in my tracks every time. Dolores Fitch came to see. She stood in the doorway, which we had enlarged to adult height by then, and looked at the growing interior with an expression I could not read. She was not a woman whose face gave much away. She walked the perimeter slowly, bending to look at the bean roots, pinching a tomato leaf and holding it to her nose, examining the earthworm-rich soil at the base of the wall with the attention of someone who had grown up farming and knew what healthy soil looked like. She stood in the center circle and looked up through the hatch at the sky. "Your grandmother," she said finally. "Yes, Gertrude Voss was in this diner every Tuesday morning for 20 years, Dolores said. She never talked about what she was doing in this silo, not a word." She paused. People thought she was peculiar, growing old alone in this town, hauling buckets of creek mud in a wheelbarrow. Her neighbor, Harold Petch, told everyone she'd gone a little soft in the head. I waited. "Harold Petch's well went dry in 1936, Dolores said. He lost his topsoil in 35 and his well in 36 and his seed corn in 37. Gertrude Voss brought him vegetables every Thursday through 3 years of Dust Bowl, left them on his porch without knocking. He never thanked her." She turned to look at me. I know because I watched. She was quiet for a long moment. "What do you need?" It was that simple. Dolores Fitch decided that we were Gertrude Voss's grandchildren in deed as well as blood. And after that, Harwick began to open to us in ways that a town only opens when someone it trusts has vouched for you. We got the glass for the south light slot from a man named Thurman Cole who was demolishing his old smokehouse and had pains to spare. We got lumber for the raised planting beds my grandmother had designed but never built, from the hardware store owner's widow who had more wood in her dead husband's storeroom than she knew what to do with. We got the galvanized pipe we needed to run rainwater from the silo roof into a cistern from a retired plumber named Emil, who had been looking for something useful to do with his afternoons since 1944. In exchange for all of this, we gave what we had. Vegetables from the first summer harvest, seed packets divided from my grandmother's original stock, and hours of work. Mara kept accounts in a notebook of her own, recording everything with a precision that later people would marvel at, but which at the time was simply practical. We had nothing, and everyone who helped us had very little, and precise accounting was the only honest way to manage that. The first harvest came in July. We had more food than 2 people could eat, which had been my grandmother's design. She had calculated the silo's output at full production as enough to sustain 6 to 8 people through a full year. At maximum yield, with the raised beds completed and the climbing system mature, she had estimated something closer to 12. We were 2 people, we had food for 12. I loaded a wheelbarrow. Mara wrote a list, and we went to feed people. Dolores Fitch let us set up a table outside the diner on Saturday mornings. We spread whatever was ready: tomatoes, beans, squash, cucumbers, bundles of herbs, jars of whatever we had preserved that week. We priced everything below what it would have cost shipped from the city. For the families we knew were struggling, we charged nothing and made no ceremony of it. Harwick had not had fresh local produce since before the Dust Bowl. The nearest grocery carried canned goods and shipped vegetables that had traveled so far they arrived half dead. Our tomatoes were picked that morning, still warm from the silo air, still smelling of the plant they'd grown from. The first Saturday, 3 people came. The second Saturday, 11. By August, there was a line. I want to be careful here because I do not want to make this sound easy or swift or inevitable. It was not. There were weeks when I lay awake in the loft listening to the wind move across the ventilation hatch and counted what we had and what we owed and found the numbers frightening. There were weeks when the arithmetic of our situation, 2 teenagers without official status or legal standing or any safety net whatsoever, felt less like a challenge and more like a wall. Mara's response to these moments was always practical. "What's the specific problem?" she would ask. And then she would think about it until she found an answer, or a partial answer, or at least the shape of an approach, and that was always enough to get through the night. The specific problem in October of that first year was winter. The silo's microclimate was extraordinary in 3 seasons. My grandmother's notebook was clear that with proper management of the ventilation hatch and the addition of a second south-facing glass slot, the interior temperature could be maintained above freezing through a Kansas winter. But there was a gap in her documentation, a winter she had not detailed, 1943, when she had been sick and the notebook grew sparse and then stopped for 4 months. She didn't grow through the winter of 43, I told Mara. That's the only winter we don't have data for, Mara said, which means we don't actually know if it works. We're going to find out. Yes, she said, we are. We added the second glass slot in September, cut with care using Emil's tools. We insulated the door with salvaged wool batting between 2 layers of canvas. We added a second baffle to the hatch, adjustable, that could narrow the ventilation opening during hard freezes without eliminating airflow entirely. And in November, when the first hard freeze came to eastern Kansas and the temperature dropped to 12 degrees overnight, the interior of the silo held at 38, not tropical, not warm, but above freezing. The hardy crops, the root vegetables, and the winter greens my grandmother had listed for cold season planting survived. The herbs in the innermost circle, closest to the stove's warmth, continued producing. We grew food through the winter of 1947 in a decommissioned grain silo on the edge of a dying town. We grew food when the ground outside was frozen 8 inches deep and nothing in the surrounding 100 miles was producing anything at all. And in January, when the cold settled in and the roads became difficult and the people of Harwick were eating from their own dwindling stores and what the grocery could bring in from the city, we had tomatoes. Vine-ripened tomatoes in January in Kansas, Dolores Fitch cried when I brought them to the diner. I had never seen her cry before, and I did not know what to do, so I set the crate on the counter and stepped back, and she put her hand on the tomatoes very gently, as if they might disappear. "Your grandmother," she said for the second time. "Yes," I said. She knew this was possible. She proved it possible. We just followed her instructions. Dolores looked at me. "Eliot, do you understand what you have here? There is nothing like this for 100 miles in any direction. Nothing that grows food in winter. Nothing that isn't dependent on the railroad and the weather and the price of diesel." She paused. "Do you understand what that means to a town like Harwick?" I had begun to understand, but it was Mara who understood it completely. She had been working on the problem all autumn, in the evenings when the silo was warm and I was reading and she was filling a new notebook with columns of figures that I had learned not to interrupt. In December, she showed me what she had been building. It was a plan. Detailed, specific, practical in the way that Mara was always practical. Without sentimentality, but also without meanness. It was a plan for what the silo could become if we stopped thinking about it as our home and started thinking about it as something that belonged to the town. "We can't grow enough in one silo to feed 300 people, she said. "Not indefinitely. But we can grow enough to prove the method. And once the method is proved..." She turned a page to a diagram she had drawn, careful and precise, showing Harwick's western edge, the half-acre lot around our silo, and the empty lots adjacent. "There are 4 abandoned properties within 100 yards of us, 3 with structures that could be converted, 1 open lot that would work for outdoor growing with windbreak planting." She laid out the arithmetic with the patience of a teacher. If each structure could house even a quarter of what our silo produced, and the open lot added cold-hardy outdoor crops, the total output would be sufficient to supply fresh vegetables to every family in Harwick year-round, with surplus to sell in the surrounding towns. "We would need help," I said. "We would need a lot of help," she agreed. "We'd need people who know farming, carpentry, systems. We'd need the town to decide that this matters enough to work for." "Why would they?" Mara looked at me steadily. "Because they are hungry," she said. "Not starving, but hungry in the way that a town gets hungry when it has been poor for 15 years and dependent on outside supply for everything it needs. They are hungry and they know it, and they are looking for a reason to believe that something can change." She paused. "We just have to show them the tomatoes." The meeting at the diner happened in February. Dolores arranged it and 17 people came, which was more than either of us expected. Farmers mostly. People who knew soil and growing and the specific vocabulary of agricultural failure, which everyone in eastern Kansas had been fluent in since 1935. Mara presented the plan. She was 14 years old, and she stood at the front of Dolores Fitch's diner with my grandmother's notebook and her own notebook and a diagram she had drawn on 2 pieces of paper taped together, and she explained, precisely and completely, what we had found and what we had proved and what we believed was possible. There was skepticism, of course there was. A silo for grain storage, not for growing. The economics of it, who would own what and how labor would be compensated. The structural questions about the other buildings, whether what worked in our silo would work in different configurations. There was also Harold Petch, who was 63 years old and had received vegetables on his porch for 3 years from a woman he had never thanked, and who sat in the back of that diner with his hat in his hands, looking at the diagram with the expression of a man who was doing a private accounting of his own debts. He was the first one to speak when Mara finished. "What do you need from us?" he said. "I want to tell you about what followed honestly, without the compression that makes things look simpler than they were. It took 2 more years. It was not swift or smooth or without conflict. There were weeks when the cooperation between families that Mara's plan required almost collapsed under the weight of old arguments, old debts, old grievances that had nothing to do with growing food and everything to do with 15 years of being poor together. There were weeks when I was not sure we were old enough to be holding any of this together. But the tomatoes helped. Every week there were tomatoes in January and February and March, growing in curved corrugated steel 48 feet tall, proof that the method worked, proof that my grandmother had been right, proof that something that looked like nothing had been quietly building towards something for 12 years. By 1949, there were 4 growing structures on the western edge of Harwich, our original silo, converted with the help of Emil and a retired engineer named Davies who had seen similar structures in Europe during the war. A converted granary owned by the Petch family, now Harold's project and his penance, managed with a devotion that my grandmother would have recognized. A refurbished root cellar expanded and glazed by Thurman Cole's son, who turned out to have an engineering mind that surprised his father completely, and the open lot, wind-braked with fast-growing hawthorn and given over to cold-hardy outdoor cultivation under the management of 3 families who had pooled their labor and were growing together what none of them could have grown alone. Harwich, in 1949, was feeding itself. Not completely, not every calorie. The grocery still operated and the railroad still came, but the fresh food, the vegetables, the herbs, the preserved goods, the seeds, the things that had been coming from far away at prices that cut into every family's budget, those things were growing in Harwich now, and the surplus went to the towns within 20 miles, Dalton, Reardon, Sutter's Crossing, small places like Harwich that had been dependent on outside supply and were increasingly interested in what we had learned. In the spring of 1950, a drought began. I will not romanticize it. I lived through the Dust Bowl years as a child, and I knew what drought meant to this land. When May passed dry and June passed drier and the creek east of town fell to a trickle and the sky over Kansas turned that particular shade of pale white blue that means no rain is coming, I felt the fear in my stomach like a stone. The valley farms began to suffer in July. The corn went first, then the sorghum, then the pasture grass. Wells that had been reliable for generations dropped and some of them did not come back. Our structures did not suffer. That was the truth of it, and I want to say it plainly because it is still the central thing I learned from my grandmother's experiment. The indoor growing systems, the climate-controlled interiors, the soil we had been building and enriching for 3 years, they did not depend on the rain. They did not depend on the surface temperature. They did not depend on the weather at all, because they had been designed by a woman who had watched the Dust Bowl take everything from this land and had decided to build something the weather could not touch. We increased production. We hired workers from the farms that had lost their crops, paying in food and in cash from the sales to surrounding towns. We worked every hour of daylight and some of the dark. We did not give the food away. I want to be clear about this too, because there is a version of this story where we are purely selfless, and that is not honest. We needed money. We needed to pay for seed, for materials, for the wages of the people we hired. We sold what we grew at prices that were fair and that, because we were one of the very few sources of fresh food in the region, were also enough to keep us solvent. But we sold at the same price to everyone. The families with money and the families without, and we maintained a portion of our production as reserve, free to anyone who came to us unable to pay, because my grandmother had written in her notebook, and it had become the closest thing we had to a charter, feed people, that is the entire instruction. The people came from a long way away that summer. By August, there were automobiles on the road to Harwich that had driven from as far as 60 miles. Families we had never met, farmers whose wells had run dry and whose crops were dust. They came with whatever they had to trade, or with nothing, and we fed them. Harold Petch came to me one evening in the 3rd week of August. He had been working in the granary growing system since dawn, and he was tired in the particular way of a man who has found something worth being tired for. He sat on the edge of the wheelbarrow and looked at the line of people waiting at our distribution table. She knew, he said. I didn't need to ask who he meant. She spent 15 years building this, alone, with nobody helping her and nobody believing her. And she knew this was possible. She knew this is what it would become. I thought about the notebook's last entry. Someone is going to need this. She knew someone would need it, I said. She didn't know it would be this many people. Harold was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I never thanked her. No, I said. I'm sorry for that. I know you are, I said. She probably knew it too, and she fed you anyway. He put his hat back on and went back to work. Mara graduated from Harwick's small high school in 1950. She had taught herself college-level botany and soil science from the Agricultural Extension Library in Dalton, and from correspondence with a professor at Kansas State who had heard about what we were doing and written to ask about our methods. He visited in the fall of 1950 with 2 graduate students and a soil testing kit, and spent a week on his hands and knees in the silo floor, measuring what 12 years of my grandmother's careful husbandry had produced. The soil report he published the following year described the interior growing medium as possessing organic carbon levels and microbial density that matched the finest agricultural soils in the state, achieved without irrigation beyond our cistern system and without chemical amendment of any kind. He credited Gertrude Voss by name and described her work as a significant practical contribution to the understanding of soil ecology in arid climate environments. It was the first time her name appeared in print with anything other than the deed transfer of a condemned structure. Mara went to Kansas State in 1951 on a scholarship that the same professor arranged. She came back every summer and at Christmas, and she wrote letters full of science that I read carefully because she was always building something in her mind and I needed to understand what it was. In 1953, she came back with a husband named Peter, who was a soil scientist and a quiet man and who understood immediately when he walked into the silo, this thing we had built from a sealed grain elevator and 2 notebooks and a great stubbornness, that he was entering something that had already decided what it was going to be. They worked together for the rest of their lives on what became the Voss Agricultural Cooperative, 18 families by 1955. Covering 6 structures on the western edge of Harwick and a growing outdoor enterprise that eventually encompassed 40 acres of the surrounding land. They documented everything. Mara published her first paper in 1957, the second in 1959, the third in 1961. By 1965, the methods developed in a condemned grain silo in a dying town of 312 people were being studied by agricultural programs in 6 states. I married a woman named Ruth in 1952. She was a teacher, practical and steady and with a dry humor that balanced my tendency toward earnestness. We had children who grew up in the silo's shadow, playing in the greenhouse structures, learning to plant before they learned to read. Understanding soil the way children understand their native language, not from study but from immersion. I am an old man now. My knees do not like the Kansas winters and my hands are permanently stained from 30 years of soil and I would not change 1 year of it. The silo still stands. We added a second story in 1955, a glass-enclosed growing level above the original interior, accessible by a new staircase that replaced the old wall ladder. The ventilation hatch is motorized now, adjusted by a thermostat that Mara's son designed. The growing circle inside has been producing without interruption since 1947. Harwick is not dying anymore. The population is 1,100. There is a school, a medical clinic, a small processing facility that handles the cooperative's preserved goods and ships them to groceries in Wichita and Kansas City. The cooperative employs 43 people full-time and provides supplemental income to twice that many farming families. None of this is exceptional by the standards of large agriculture. We are small. We are local. We have never been anything else and never tried to be, but we have never missed a harvest. Through droughts and floods, through market collapses and supply chain failures, through every disruption that the decades have brought to the business of feeding people, The growing structures on the western edge of Harwick have produced without stopping, because the soil is healthy, because the system was designed by a woman who understood that the conditions for growing matter more than any single crop, because she spent 12 years building something in a condemned silo that no one believed had any value, and she documented every day of it, and left it for someone who would come after her and be hungry enough to be patient. I went into the silo last spring on the morning of my 68th birthday. I went alone, early, before the workers arrived. I ducked through the low door, habit and memory, though the door is full height now and has been for 20 years. I stood in the center circle in the column of light that still falls from the hatch above, the same light that fell there in 1947, unchanged. The soil was dark and fragrant under my boots. The climbing beans had started their spring ascent up the wall ribs. The tomato seedlings were already a foot tall. I put my hand on the soil and felt its warmth and its density, the life working in it. The earthworms my grandmother had introduced in 1935, whose descendants were still here, still turning this earth, still doing the slow, patient work that the surface world can never see. The most valuable things are the ones you cannot see. My grandmother wrote that. My grandmother, whom I never met, who left us $3 worth of condemned land and 12 years of notebooks and the instruction, feed people. We are still feeding people. The growing never stops. I want to say one more thing before I'm done. On the east wall of the original silo, at eye level, there is a line carved into the steel. Harold Petch carved it in 1952 after the drought, with a cold chisel and more precision than I would have expected from a 65-year-old farmer's hands. It is still there. It will be there after all of us are gone. It says, what they call worthless, they simply haven't looked beneath. My grandmother never saw those words. She died 6 weeks before we arrived. She never knew that her sealed silo became a place where people came when they had nowhere else to go. She never saw the line of automobiles in August 1950, the families from 60 miles away who came to Harwick because Harwick was one of the only places in 100 miles where things were still growing. She only knew what she had spent 12 years building. She only knew what the soil could do if you cared for it with patience. She only knew that someone was going to need this, and she made sure the instructions were clear. I try to live by that. I try to build things that will be useful to whoever comes after me. Whether I know who they are or not, I try to document what I learn. I try to care for the things in my keeping with enough faithfulness that they survive me and go on being useful in ways I cannot predict. This is not a complicated idea. It is the oldest idea there is. We have simply forgotten it. Feed people. Care for the soil. Trust that the growing, the real growing, the deep kind, never stops. And when you are standing in the middle of something that everyone told you was worthless, in the column of light coming through the top of a condemned grain silo on the edge of a dying town, with your 14-year-old sister's hand resting on the back of your chair like an anchor, believe her when she says we have $3 and that is enough to begin. It was enough. It is always enough if you are patient and you dig.